Hello friends, this is your friend back with a new fanfic. What if Naruto dominated Earthland as Storm King with Cana by his side? Episode 1. If you like this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Now, after a mysterious dimensional storm transports Naruto to Earthland, an ancient force recognizes him as the prophesied Storm King. A legendary adventure is about to begin. Now, let's start. Kurama. Naruto yelled out as the nine-tailed beast was forced out of the blonde's body. The blonde recoiled backwards and began to fall from a height of 50 meters, immediately feeling the drain from the loss of the Biju in his stomach. A Jinchuriki without their Biju will die. I can't let it end like this. When did I ever give up? I'll never give in. I'm not Hokage. I won't ever stop fighting back because I choose to fight back. Everyone is relying on me. Naruto roared internally to himself as he grit his teeth. Naruto barely managed to right himself in midair, only with the strongest of determination did he manage to even move by himself. The blonde reached into his back pouch and quickly removed a kunai and a seal tag with an intricate design as quickly as his deteriorating body would let him. Barely managing to wrap the seal around the kunai at a painfully slow speed before he hit the ground, Naruto threw the projectile at the retreating chakra body of the Kyuubi. This was all he could do. His physical condition was at its lowest, and his mind was shutting down. If he failed, that was it. He could do nothing more at this moment but hope. I'm not letting you go. Madara stared impassively at the fallen blonde and his approaching kunai. Uncaring and indifferent to the fallen blonde, all of his plans should now proceed smoothly with that problem child out of the way. He knew that Naruto was a distinguished user of seals, but he was certain that there was nothing that the weak child could do now that all of the tailed beasts and the chakra construct of the Kyuubi were in his chains. Naruto could only stare as his kunai went closer and closer to his partner. Time began to slow down. If the kunai reached Kyuubi in time, then he might have a chance to win and survive. However, if the kunai did not reach the chakra construct of his Biju in time, then he would definitely die and the whole shinobi alliance would fall to the Moon-Eye Plan. Please make it. Naruto screamed internally. At this point, he wasn't even able to move his mouth. Right before Madara brought all of the chain-tailed beasts to himself, a flash of light erupted, enveloping and spreading over the whole battlefield. All of the shinobi in the alliance force raised their arms to shield their eyes from the blinding light, despite the fact that they were miles away from the main conflict. Madara Uchiha stared on passively, his eyes staring coldly at the light without batting an eyelash. When the light had dissipated, the scene before the legendary shinobi made him widen his eyes slightly in shock, but he kept that emotion in check, keeping the ever-famous stoic Uchiha look on his face. However, internally, Madara was going through a mental storm and could not understand how the blonde had survived. The blonde was standing tall and proud once more, the last bits of orange chakra receding into his stomach as a houri with tattoos and lines appeared once more around the blonde. His blue eyes that were a moment before closing from almost dying were now open wide with determination. His orange-colored eyes with a cross looked up and zoned in on his final opponent, looking down on him from his tall summon. Nice job, Naruto. But what did you do? Naruto let out a breath of relief when he heard the deep voice in his mind. The legendary shinobi still had not moved, and that unnerved the blonde slightly, but he would bide his time to prepare. I threw a seal that attached to you which would immediately seal yourself back into me. It's an aberration of Two Sans Horishan, Flying Thunder God. Without technical terms, I can move the things that my seal touches near my own body, but in this case, I just redirected you back into my body. Because the seal was previously broken, however, there is no seal blocking you now. Naruto remarked with a slight frown, realizing that the cage was open. Not that he really minded, he knew Kurama would stand by his side and fight the cursed Uchiha. The question was afterwards. Kyuubi immediately began to laugh with glee and, was that sadism? The strongest of the tailed beasts walked until he was in front of the tall, metal bars that had prevented him from leaving for decades. Giving it an experimental push, Kurama was pleased with the results. It opened. I may not be on the same level as my Tu-san or my Ka-chan when it comes to seals, but with this development, we can completely merge and perform a true Biju mode. Kurama cackled in ecstasy, his laughter now reaching a new height of maniacal glee. Finally, the chance to get out of his cursed cage and destroy everything in his path was before him. He accepted it without a second thought. Years of pent-up energy were residing in him, and it was finally time for it to let out a giant explosion of chakra when he went all out. Naruto, I'm warning you right now. This will be extremely dangerous. We will be merging our chakras for the short time we go into our complete transformation, but shut up and do it already, you damned fox. You know nothing is going to stop me now. Not you or even my parents, so let's get this damn show on the road, Ttebao. That bastard is going down. Naruto interrupted Kurama, his voice resonating in his mindscape. Kurama simply chuckled, having expected that answer from his container. You don't disappoint, Naruto. Then, let's get wild, let's do this, Ttebao. The two roared at the same time. Madara, who was still looking on impassively, suddenly took on a battle stance when he noted the blonde's chakra levels increasing to exceptional levels. It quickly rose to the capping point of his Biju Sage mode. However, instead of slowing down or stopping at the peak of his chakra level, the blonde's chakra continued to explode, growing larger and larger, now exceeding Madara's and Hashirama's chakra levels combined at their primes. By the time the chakra growth finally began to slow down, its density was at such a level that it actually began to press down on the legendary shinobi, and the ground underneath the blonde began to crack and split from the intense pressure. Here I come. The blonde snarled in a somewhat demonic tone. His voice had converged with the Kyuubi's, making it seem as if the two were speaking together. Naruto flashed forwards, the ground exploding under his feet. Not even a moment later, Naruto appeared in front of Madara in an orange flash, a Rasengan already fully formed in his right hand. Anyone else wouldn't have been able to see the blonde's insane speed or movement, but Madara wasn't normal by any stretch of the imagination. He had the Rinnegan and the highest echelon of the Sharingan. Madara dodged the incoming Rasengan and immediately retaliated with a lightning-fast punch that made Naruto go flying back. However, Naruto dispersed in a cloud of smoke after taking the solid hit, revealing that it was a clone. When did he make a clone? I couldn't even notice with my Rinnegan. Madara thought to himself. Although he had experience and technique under his belt, he would now have to act cautiously. It may just save his life in this case, now that the blonde was much stronger than moments before. However, the black-haired shinobi received no respite. A fully formed Rasenshuriken was already homing in his direction from behind. The targeted shinobi felt a small feeling of disappointment hit him. The blonde was still acting so predictably, so victory wouldn't be too difficult. And here he thought he would have a challenge that equaled or surpassed Hashirama. Simply moving his hand towards the dangerous Kinjutsu, Madara began to absorb the Kinjutsu. However, the deadly attack suddenly dispersed into smoke, revealing a smirking clone with another Rasenshuriken at the ready. Madara widened his eyes in surprise, immediately moving up both of his hands in a position that Naruto knew too well. Shinra Tensai. The clone flew backwards, dispelling in a cloud of smoke. There was no other way for Madara to prevent that attack from hitting him. The speed at which the clone was approaching him was ridiculous, even faster than the Raikage with his lightning armor activated. If the attack had hit, there was a very small possibility the legendary shinobi would have survived. The fact that his chakra points would have been destroyed only increased the high chances for his death. However, again leaving no time for Madara to muse on his situation, Another Biju mode clone suddenly appeared behind Madara, his body glowing an even brighter orange. The Rasenshuriken in his hands began to turn somewhat purple as two chakra arms rotated around the spinning sphere, eventually creating a Biju Rasenshuriken. Strike the small possibility for survival. Anyone hit by that ability would surely be killed. Madara could see the amount of chakra placed into the ability and how deadly the technique truly was with his Rinnegan. For Kami's sake, even without his eyes, he could feel the ridiculous amount of chakra placed into the ability. There was no way he would let himself be hit by that technique. Your 5 seconds aren't up yet, so take this. Naruto yelled out as he threw the gigantic spiraling sphere. This has to be finished. Naruto decided internally, only to widen his eyes in disbelief. Madara once again merely moved his hands in front of him in the chakra-intensive ability. What the hell? His eyes are so ridiculous. There should be a limit to how much his ability can absorb. The blonde complained. Seriously, the Rinnegan was stupidly overpowered. However, instead of feeling disappointment, Naruto's frown slowly grew into a smirk, his feral features becoming even more sinister and animal-like. Caught you, he said before dispelling. Madara heard this right before being struck from below, a Rasenshuriken appearing from under the ground. The moment that he was hit by the Rasenshuriken, he stopped absorbing the Biju Rasenshuriken from the sudden impact. The Biju Rasenshuriken flew forwards once more, and this time struck true. A large explosion rocked the very earth for miles around, creating splits and cracks on the ground, some areas splitting up large enough to make a fissure. What happened? What's going on? Many of the remaining ninjas of the Shinobi Alliance were confused and worried about the impact. If Madara had that kind of potential, which they knew he had from the fact he could make meteors fall out of the sky, then what was awaiting them? However, Hinata's next words brought relief and exhilaration to all of the ninjas in the cages. It was Naruto. The lavender-eyed Hyuga stated, yelling it so that all of the ninjas could hear. The ninjas began to cheer, seeing the possible end of the battle. Back at the battlefield, a large cloud of dust screened Naruto's view. However, that small detail didn't prevent Jinchuriki from creating clones and throwing hundreds of kunais with specially made explosive tags. Again, another heavy explosion shook the earth, but the level of destruction was not comparable to that of the Biju Rasenshuriken. After he had thrown all but a few of his weapons, Naruto waited, staring intently into the clouds of dust to see what happened to the Uchiha. Naruto quickly allowed himself a moment to think about the other Uchiha, Sasuke. I can feel Sasuke's energy returning. Good, he's alive. Naruto's Sage mode disappeared when its time ran out. Heavy exhaustion immediately took its place, but the Biju mode continued to remain on Naruto, and it didn't seem like it would be disappearing too soon. We can only hold onto this transformation for about another minute now that your Sage mode ran out, Naruto. What will you do? Naruto smirked in response as he crossed his arms. Don't tell me you didn't see it, you almighty fox. Naruto taunted, a wide smirk in place as his orange eyes zoned in on where he felt all of the negative emotions coming from the nine-tailed fox snorted in response, but inwardly, he was curious. What did Naruto do that even he, the almighty demon, couldn't see? When the smoke and dust had cleared, Madara was standing, but obviously with some difficulty. Instead of succumbing to the tortuous pain, the man began to yell with exertion as his perfect Susanoo appeared over him, looming hundreds of feet tall over the blonde. Naruto just shook his head, his smirk still in place. You lose. Fuan, seal. Suddenly, Madara's ultimate defense disappeared. The last enemy felt himself begin to lose his chakra and his body begin to disappear into another realm, knowing the feeling from using Kamui on himself. He looked up at the blonde with hatred when he felt that he couldn't prevent the teleportation. What have you done? He said in an ice-cold tone, but even Naruto could see the cracks starting to become apparent. The shinobi in front of him was going insane from rage now that his grand plans seemed to be at an end. Naruto released his Biju mode, his glowing orange eyes turning to cold, dead blue eyes. He immediately felt the strain of using the completed Biju mode but kept the pain and stress hidden under his composed gaze. He stared at Madara and looked down at the laying figure of the legendary shinobi. I'm only paying you back with interest. You have killed my friends and my family. And so, I have decided that your punishment would be to be sealed in my creation, a pocket dimension where you can't use your own teleportation techniques because your chakra would have already been sealed away, never to be in your grasp again. At this point, Naruto's composed gaze changed to one of sarcasm and anger. Perfect, isn't it? The very cursed eye that could help people to teleport cannot be used in my realm. Humiliation for such a legendary shinobi is fitting for someone like you. You won't be able to use the Rinnegan because you have no ability to use chakra anymore. You won't be able to kill anyone anymore. In fact, you only have another 20 seconds until all of your chakra disappears, becoming latent in your body until the day you die in my dimension. You, Madara Uchiha, have failed. Slightly panting after his short speech, Naruto took a moment to regain his breath. You were saying that you weren't a seal master. And it's good to know you're taking that sadist nature from me. Naruto coughed mentally and told Kurama to shut up. I see, I don't need to know when you did it, but this will be my final action then before I leave this world forever. Madara grunted at his position on the floor, already knowing the futility of fighting against a seal that had been placed against him. Naruto suddenly felt the chakra in the vulnerable shinobi increase to heightened measures. He's going to kill himself if he uses chakra to that level when he's that low. Naruto thought to himself in confusion. Kurama, unlike his container, already knew what the insane man was doing. Naruto, get out of the way. Kurama warned. Naruto tried to respond, but it was too late. His body was already being up by the Uchiha's last jutsu. Madara, seeing the blonde's body slowly swirling into a portal that he created, closed his eyes. Naruto was too drained to move freely, and like Madara, already knew the futility of fighting back this time. He sure as hell wasn't one to give up, but even he wasn't that stupid. Fighting in the war and seeing his friends die had made him more realistic and understanding of situations. And his situation right now was unavoidable. If I die, then the shinobis will never have their hero back. Madara stated with a final smirk before dying. The only sign that the man had gone to the next life was that Naruto could not feel Madara's chakra any longer, which was a relief. His friends and family would finally be able to live, and his purpose in life seemed complete. Peace. As his final action in this world, Naruto slowly scrawled out a last message onto a sealing paper and dropped it on the ground wrapped around a kunai. Right when the kunai hit the dirt, Naruto disappeared. Hinata, who had seen everything occur, rushed from her position and sprinted to where Naruto last stood. Despite the pain of overexertion and chakra exhaustion taking over her body, she continued to run. When she reached the scarred battlefield, she ignored the deceased enemy and went straight for the paper and kunai. On it were scrawled two barely legible words in Naruto's handwriting that would make all that were close to the blonde cry from the loss of a precious person. Goodbye, everyone. X Shuya X. Location. Mindscape. And I'm back in this sewer again. How'd I do, Kurama? The fox snorted, but grinned with a feral smirk. Not bad, Kit. Not bad at all. We finally killed Madara and ended the war, even if the consequence was that you had to leave the hidden nations. Naruto stopped floating in the sewer water and got off his back in favor of standing on top of the water. Giving the fox a confused look with a tilted head, he asked, "What are you talking about just me, for? Aren't you in the same boat?" As if to answer his question, the fox's body started to glow, becoming ephemeral. Chakra began to escape from the body of the fox, but instead of the normal red and deep crimson, it was a gold color, the color of purified chakra. Bijus like us cannot leave dimensions. We would mess up timelines and create huge paradoxes, which you would have known if you had actually carefully read your father's notes about space-time techniques. The fact that you are even able to leave with your status as Jinchuriki is strange by itself. In fact, there are already changes being made to your body. Naruto looked down at his body and noticed that his hands were smaller and that his favorite jumpsuit and sage clothing had strangely become too large for him. What he noticed was that the Kyuubi's chakra levels were increasing. The blonde looked up at the fox with a worried and devastated look. No. You can't do that, Kurama. We're partners. A Jinchuriki isn't one without his Biju. Naruto cried out, his voice cracking. Tears made its way to the blonde's eyes, but he didn't rub them away. It was just water. Men don't cry. That's what he told Inari. He wasn't crying. Despite the fact that the fox had given him hell in his early years, Kurama was the one constant in Naruto's life that had never left him. Especially in their last year together, the demon fox and the sage had become somewhat close friends, relying on the other and helping the other complete their goals. One wanted to destroy Madara, and the other wanted to bring peace to the nations. Both had succeeded. Kurama's smirk dropped slightly at Naruto's plea and the sight of tears running down his face, but his grin returned when he noticed Naruto was still shrinking in size until he returned to his early teen years. You're such a loud brat again, huh? I may be powerful and almighty, but even I cannot go from dimension to dimension. However, my other half is rejoining with me, meaning that you will have full access to my chakra in whatever new dimension you end up in. You won't even need to ask me for permission anymore. Kurama explained, trying to lighten the mood. Naruto stared up at the fox in its cage in silence, hiccuping from trying to force down his rising emotions. When he felt he had regained control of himself to an acceptable level, he slowly walked up to the cage and raised his fist, tears silently running down his face. Thanks Kurama, for everything. For making me suffer in my early years but giving me the best last year a shinobi could ask for. For being my partner, and my friend. But what will happen to you when I disappear from this dimension, then? Kurama's smirk widened as he brought his fist forwards to meet the blonde's in a fist bump. I'll finally be free, roaming the elemental nations once more with my chakra complete once more. I'll be seeing you, Naruto. And with that, Kurama disappeared, his golden chakra dispersing from the cage and escaping into the whole sewer. Naruto kept his fist raised before he broke down and began to cry uncontrollably, the hiccups returning as dropped to his knees and slammed his fist on the ground repeatedly, each strike shaking the mindscape from the extraordinary force from each strike. The implications of leaving his home finally hit him like lightning. No more friends, no Ba-chan, no Sakura, no Shizune, no Shikamaru, and not even Kurama. His constant was now gone from his life. The dam of emotions flooded. What would happen in the new dimension he would end up in? He could end up anywhere, and anything could happen to him. Would the people he would meet have the same values as he? Would they even be people? Eventually, the blonde calmed down and forced himself to smile. Sulking and acting depressed were for the weak with nothing better to do. Naruto regained his composure and began to think methodically through the infinite possibilities, but ended up sitting down and resting his chin against his palm as he waited, patiently. Well, if worst comes to worst, like ending up in space, I can go into my own dimension and study my Two-San's signature technique to teleport to a world. Do I still have the notes? Wait, Naruto's mood lifted as he remembered that he had not only copied the notes for the Hiraishin, but also the whole Jutsu index inside the Forbidden Scroll when he was preparing for his final battle, which he had sealed into his skin. When training, he had learned a surprising amount of techniques due to both the Kage Bunshin and a surprising development. He realized that he not only had a major affinity for wind, which he already knew, but also two slightly smaller affinities for lightning and water. Those two extra affinities made training different elemental jutsus that much easier, but he had not yet mastered the complete manipulation of his sub-affinities yet. Suddenly, Naruto was forced out of his mindscape. Opening his eyes in surprise, he was exposed to his new surroundings. His blue eyes noticed spinning circular gates, which he was in the center of as he floated in this endless loop of space. The gates never ended, and he noticed that he wasn't able to leave the large circles, no matter what he did. The horizon, if that was what it was black and orange, consistently changing as he went along the gates. Whoa, this is pretty cool. But where am I? Well, that was a stupid question. No one's going to answer me because I'm alone in here. Naruto said to himself with a pout, his normal attitude already showing signs of returning. After nearly 30 minutes of continuous floating, a small tear opened up in the space, which Naruto fell into. For some reason, the blonde knocked out when he fell through the small space gate, but that reason remains unknown. X Shuya X. Location: Fairy Tale's Guild Hall. Makarov, the third guild master of Fairy Tale, took a large sip from his cup of beer and set the cup back on the counter. He was currently relaxing as he stared at his guild members, his children, fighting again and creating another ruckus. The old man let out a sigh of content, completely fine with letting the bar fight continue as long as it didn't get too out of hand. Mira was having one of her usual fights with Urza. As the two butted heads, lightning cackled between the two in a show of heavy rivalry. Gray and Natsu were also having their famous rivalry battle in another part of the guild hall, although neither of the two was using their respective magic. And of course, the rest of the guild was fighting as well, throwing beer bottles and tables, quickly making the small skirmish into an all-out bar battle. Makarov took another sip of his beer and looked up. Laxus had his headphones on and was staring down at the bar fight with an apathetic look, but Makarov could tell that even his usually stoic grandson wanted to get into the middle of things. However, there was no one really strong enough in there to make him interested since Guildarts was currently taking a mission that would last another month. For a moment, Makarov noted a high-level magical release, but he quickly dismissed it. He assumed that someone was training or currently on a mission. However, when he felt the magical release fluctuating uncontrollably and approaching the guild building, Makarov dropped his content expression and became serious. He spread out his senses and realized that it was coming from above the building, and it was coming fast. In fact, it should have struck about. Wah! What the hell? The guild members yelled out or shrieked in unison. All of the members raised their weapons or got into a fighting stance, prepared to take down the intruder. However, when the smoke dispelled, what was revealed to crash through the ceiling and create a small crater on the guild floor was a child. What's a kid doing here? One of the members asked. The rest of the guild members just shook their heads in a similar state of confusion. No one had the slightest idea what a child was doing in the guild, especially one that had fallen through the ceiling. Fight me! Natsu, being the idiot that he was, yelled out his challenge as he lit his hands on fire to fight. He was promptly struck down when an irritated Urza punched the pink-haired dragon slayer in the jaw, sending Natsu crashing into one of the guild's walls. Gray immediately began to sweat profusely as Urza turned her sights onto the ice mage. Were you fighting with Natsu again? Gray shook his head over and over again. Screw his pride. Urza was a monster and hit harder than Elfman when she was pissed. The guild members continued to stare at the child, all of them sympathetic for him when the smoke had completely cleared to give a perfect view of the platinum-haired youth. They all ignored their previous defensive thoughts and ran towards the unconscious boy, noting that all of his clothes were torn and were much too large for the small child, making the older guild members wonder what the small blonde had gone through in his past. When they were directly above him, a small detail that everyone noticed was that he had 3 small whiskers on each cheek. Makarov was still sitting on the bar counter, but now he was staring at the child in interest and worry. Interest because the child had been the one to give off enough magic presence to indicate he had at least A-class mage reserves, and worry because the child was injured and unconscious. However, he was probably the only one to notice that before the small child had crash-landed into the guild hall, a golden thing instinctively wrapped around the unconscious blonde and created a sort of cushion and extended to the ground to slow down the fall, completely nullifying any damage that could have happened to the small child. If he had fallen without any cushioning, it was quite safe to say that the youngster would have been severely injured. Many of the women in the guild squealed when they heard the blonde purr. One of the interested girls, Cana, had scratched a whisker on the blonde's cheek, eliciting the somewhat feline response. The brunette giggled and continued to play with the unconscious blonde's whiskers, resulting in the same response each and every time, much to the delight of the female side of the guild. The boys and men began to pout as rain clouds formed over their heads from the lack of attention from the opposite, except for Natsu, who was still cowering against the wall, staring frightfully back at Urza alongside Gray. Not exactly the attention any man would be aiming for. Makarov looked up once more to the second floor and saw that his grandson had lost his apathetic and stoic look and had taken one of interest. The lightning mage had noticed that inner strength that the small child had and was immediately interested, but was slightly disappointed when he noticed that the blonde was unconscious. However, that didn't take away his interest or his confusion as to where the small child had come from. The guild master took another drink from his cup and stared at the large circle in the middle of the guild hall. He smiled for a moment. Fairy tale really does treat everyone like a family, even if they don't know them. Many of the women were talking about how cute the blonde was. Makarov began to cry to himself as well, tears comically streaming down his face from the lack of attention as master of the guild. How the blonde had taken all of the attention away from every single man in just a minute was a true question. No man should ever allow that to happen, especially Elfman. However, the master got over his major issue quite quickly, deciding to deal with getting attention from the women later on. There were more pressing issues, for example, get that child to the infirmary. Makarov ordered loudly from his position, loud enough for the whole guild to hear. Immediately, all of the women responded, every one of them carrying the blonde as if he were the most delicate thing in the world. The ones that weren't carrying him were just following and staring at the adorable face the sleeping blonde made. Somehow, the men's depressive rain clouds became larger, and Makarov's stream of tears became even wider and stronger, creating a puddle beneath the small man. Yes, things would definitely get interesting in the guild in time. I hate hospitals so much. Those were the first thoughts that ran through Naruto's head. He opened his eyes and adjusted to the light quickly, an essential quality for any ninja. They had to be able to adjust to any situation. Naruto blinked a few times and wiggled around for a moment, feeling the softness of the cushion underneath him, and his head resting against a soft pillow. Wherever I am, it has better reception than the elemental nations. I would probably be in a cell right now. Wait, I'm younger, that's right. But still, even young ninjas were dangerous. Itachi is the perfect example. Naruto sat up in bed and propped himself against the wall, his body still stressed from using the completed Biju Sage mode from only a few hours before. The blonde quickly analyzed his surroundings and satisfied himself with the fact that no one was nearby, a small habit he had gained during the war. It was early in the morning, close to dawn. Naruto turned over to the window next to him and was greeted by a rising sun, gracefully coming over the town buildings and mountains. He stared as he stayed still, enraptured by the sight for a moment, before turning back to his room. It wasn't a large room, but it wasn't small either. Nearly 15 by 15, the room contained a comfortable bed that Naruto was currently sitting on, a cabinet on the opposite end of the room left of the door which was beside a mirror, a window above the bed, and a closet next to the bed. Naruto threw his legs over the edge of the bed and stood up, although with some trouble since he was still tired. He closed his eyes for a moment to concentrate and realized that his chakra level was low, and his capacity had dropped significantly during the time he had been unconscious. He entered his mindscape quickly and found out why. The majority of the golden chakra entered the cage and was slowly exiting to the sewer. Naruto caught on to the fact that the sewer was his current chakra capacity, which currently had about 20% of the Kyuubi's purified chakra, and that the rest were still in the cage, held back by nothing. It must be because my body can't handle all of that chakra yet. However, since my tenketsu is much wider with that much chakra, I wouldn't be surprised if I could control all of it in a few years. Kami, this more chakra means that my already awful chakra control is going to be shot. Well, since I have less chakra now, my control should have gone up, right? Naruto sat down on the sewer in a lotus position and focused on his body and his chakra points. He was slightly surprised to notice that his golden chakra was flowing much faster than his normal blue chakra. Also, the purified chakra was much more potent and in much more quantity than the blue chakra. Then, the young blonde opened his eyes and lifted his head to give an irritated glance at the giant cage full of purified chakra. Damn it! My chakra is even worse because the potency of the chakra is making it even harder to control. Screw new techniques in my Rasengan or even my variants. I'm going to have to practice chakra control until I'm at least Chunin level again. But what is strange are the floating lights that are just flying around the sewer. I've never seen them before. They feel light compared to the chakra I have. The spiky-haired blonde stood up on top of the sewer water and reached for one of the floating lights. When one of the particles of light gently rested against his finger, Naruto closed his eyes and went into a sensory mode. Immediately opening his eyes in surprise, he stared at the small light in shock before smirking. This could be helpful, very helpful. I could either use a seal to transfer this random energy into chakra or maybe I could use it when my chakra becomes low as a last resort. But then again, I don't even know what kind of world I'm in yet. Therefore, up I get. Naruto exited his mindscape and stood up. Then, walking over to the mirror near the door, he glanced at himself. He was short again, which he grudgingly noted. I can't just eat ramen this time around. I'll actually eat some healthy food during my puberty years since I actually have a chance now, as long as I'm not discriminated against. Let's see. Same anorexic and malnourished body during my prankster years, which isn't good. I'm going to need to train to make all my muscles leaner again. I'm around 4 feet 10 inches, this really, TTEBAO. But I lost all of my scars during the war and I don't have the Chidori mark where Sasuke stabbed me. Naruto gave himself a playful sneer and stuck out his tongue at his reflection, his counterpart doing the same. At least I still have my whiskers, something I can remember Kurama by other than his chakra. With that, Naruto opened the door and walked out of the room, completely ignoring the fact that he only had boxers on. Naruto walked down the hall and down some stairs, the sounds of bar fights reaching his ears. Interested, he quickened his steps until he reached a corner. Turning around, he was completely taken aback by the scene before him. A full-out bar fight was occurring, but what made Naruto even more confused was that every single person was smiling. What made the blonde even more bewildered was that some people began to pull out guns from the air. What? One large man with long white hair made his arm ridiculously gigantic and punched someone with it, sending the victim through one of the guild walls. Another teenager around Naruto's age lit his hands on fire to punch another teen that was currently. Naruto's mind was running on overdrive at this point as the blonde was completely confused. They're just controlling the flames and ice, as if they were using magic. He muttered silently to himself, not knowing just how right he was with that small observation. But the scene before him made Naruto smile. he was in a world where fighting wasn't strange and there was some sort of ability usage similar to chakra. That was all he needed to know before he walked down the stairs to the guild hall with a wide smile on his face, regardless of his current condition and clothing, or lack thereof. Naruto walked over to the bar counter and saw a small old man contentedly drinking beer as he watched the guild members fight. The blonde, however, immediately noticed the way the old man was relaxing and eyeing the situation. Despite the fact that the small man seemed relaxed, he was on a constant patrol, as if ready to jump into the fray at a moment's notice, which Naruto compared to a leader of sorts. So, Naruto walked over to the old man with some difficulty from an aching body and sat on a stool next to the old man. Is it always like this? The old master turned his head and was appalled to see how skinny the blonde looked. However, he quickly calmed down when he saw that behind the skinny nature of the blonde was lean muscle mass and a surprisingly speed-oriented body that was amazingly durable. Naruto was currently staring at the ensuing full-blown bar battle with idle interest. The blonde's cerulean flickered back and forth throughout the guild, catching the highlights of each minuscule battle. Every once in a while, the blonde would give out a small snort or smirk out of plain amusement, giving out a large one when Gray had discarded his boxers when it caught on fire. After about 10 seconds, the master responded. I'm surprised you don't think this is strange at all. The blonde waved his hand nonchalantly as if to wave off the surprised tone from the master. He gave an eye smile and grinned wide enough to show his canines. I've seen some pretty bad quirks. I'm not new to this stuff, don't worry. The master raised his eyebrows at that information. Like you walking around in your boxers. The blonde opened his eyes and smirked in response. Better than going around and fighting with ice, Naruto replied without missing a beat. Duly noted, the master responded before giving a loud belly laugh, the old man's eyes crinkling upwards in amusement. The kid was good. When Makarov had calmed down, he continued their stalled conversation. So, why are you here, little one? The blonde seemed to twitch slightly at the name the master gave him. Makarov saw it but decided not to say anything and see where the conversation would now flow to. He found it interesting that the high magic reserves that the child had shown for only a moment before crashing into Fairy Tale's guild building had all but disappeared. Now, the blonde was giving off almost no presence, which was how the blonde had sat next to the master without gaining his attention beforehand. How he got next to me after just waking up in that condition is something I don't understand. Right now, I can feel his magic reserves, and it is much lower than when he had crashed through the ceiling. This is an interesting child. Makarov thought to himself as he took another drink from his cup of beer. I'm 12, and I'm not that short. The blonde huffed out. Then, he leaned his back against the counter and continued to watch the fights. Do you know magic? The master asked, trying to steer the conversation into a different direction. The blonde smiled for a moment, as if laughing at the absurdity of the question. Wait, this is a different world. We used chakra in the elemental nations. Maybe they use magic here. That would explain what those floating lights were in my mindscape. Naruto thought to himself before responding. Isn't it right in front of me, Gigi-san? The master snorted at the name that blonde gave him. However, this means that he isn't new or unfamiliar with the concept of magic. Maybe he can join the guild. He is old enough anyways. First off, however, don't you have family waiting for you? Immediately, Naruto's face fell slightly, despite the fact he wanted to keep his history hidden. This was one thing he couldn't hide. If he had Kurama at least, then he would have been able to hide his pain, but now, he truly had nothing to remind him of his family back home. I'm an orphan, Gigi-san. For some reason, the way the child spoke and had looked down on the ground made Makarov want to help the child as much as he could. So, he decided that his first idea would be the best route. What is your name? Naruto raised his head and stared at the old man before pointing at himself with his thumb. He grinned widely, closing his eyes with an extremely wide smile. I'm Uzumaki Naruto. Makarov chuckled, taking a moment to glance at the blonde before turning back to the guild fight to make sure nothing went too out of hand. Someone named you Maelstrom. Nice name. Naruto opened his eyes to his surprise. The old man had actually understood the meaning of his name without the blonde having to tell him the actual meaning. So Naruto, how would you like to join Fairy Tail? Naruto raised his eyebrows in confusion. What's Fairy Tail? Makarov face faulted on the bar counter, making the table shake slightly. Naruto just continued to stare quizzically at the old man, still confused. However, the blonde did find it funny that the old man just dropped and face planted onto the counter when he was sitting down. Eventually, the master sat back up and coughed into his fist, as if to pretend the previous event had never happened. Makarov stared at the boy suspiciously, who stared right back with the same confused expression on his face. You don't know what Fairy Tail is? Makarov asked unbelievingly. Naruto shook his head once in denial, still sporting the same bemused face. Goodness, he's even more clueless than Natsu, at least he knew what a guild and what Fairy Tail was. Did you live under a rock or something, Naruto? How do you not know Fairy Tail, one of the most famous guilds in all of Fury? Goodness, you're sitting at a bar counter inside the strongest guild. Naruto widened his eyes before smiling cheekily. Would you be surprised if I said I did come from under a rock? Makarov face faulted again, this time slamming hard enough onto the surface to make his beer cup fall off the counter. Naruto caught it and placed it back onto the counter calmly, waiting for the master to get back up. However, he couldn't help but snigger when he saw a red-haired girl with armor manhandling the two boys that were previously using fire and ice. Again, when Makarov sat back up, the guild master immediately continued his conversation. Fairy Tail is a guild, and we treat all of our members like family. I am the third guild master of Fairy Tail, which was originally established by Mavis, our first guild master. She came up with the name because she wondered if fairies had tails. Makarov smiled wistfully, remembering his early years before he continued. In her words, do fairies really have tails? Did they even exist? Like them, this place is an eternal adventure, a never-ending adventure. So how about it, Naruto? Would you like to become a part of our family? To be a part of our guild and to start anew and to create a bright future? Naruto turned over and looked up at the guild master. For a moment, it seemed that tears were brimming on the blonde's eyes. I can have a family again. Maybe I can have another chance at having a family, like Ba-chan, Shizune-chan, everyone. Naruto nodded and was about to respond until a large explosion shook the guild hall, making Naruto stumble slightly in his seat. Both master and child turned to see what the occurrence was, only to find that every single guild member was on the floor, nearly passed out. Well, they had fought for nearly 30 minutes, but that wasn't the cause. Mira had decided to go into her full Satan soul, and she had absolutely stomped over all of the other members from their surprise at her actually going all out. Urza was still conscious and was continuing to manhandle Gray and Natsu. Gray was still. Naruto found it strange that the redhead didn't care about the fact that the boy was wearing no clothes, but who was he to say anything? Naruto took a moment to remain silent before responding with another cheeky smile of his. You have one dysfunctional family, Master San. Makarov just began to cry, tears streaming down his face as he stared at the guild hall, going through the expenses in his head to repair all of the damage. If we can blow things up, I think I'll fit right in. Naruto thought to himself, imagining himself using his smaller explosive tags during a bar fight. He shook his head before a massive grin replaced his smaller smirk. Of course, I'm going to do pranks. Hee hee hee. Naruto began to chuckle wildly inside his mind. Makarov, who was completely oblivious to what the blonde was thinking, began to cry even more as he felt a strange tingle pass through his body, warning him about future destruction, much more destruction. So, Master Gigi-san, what are you going to do about all of this? Naruto asked as he waved his hand to point out the guild hall and all of its members on the floor passed out. Tables were destroyed and upturned on the floor. Beer bottles and cups were broken, so glass was shining on the floor. Some guns were even on the floor. Makarov, instead of answering, just continued to comically cry, tears streaming down his face. It was as if the old man were sporting a geyser or something like that. Naruto's sweat dropped before asking the master a different question, since it seemed not only the bar fight was a common occurrence, which came with large damages every time, but that the master reacted almost the same every time. Okay, master. What can I do? I probably need new clothes and you need to sign me into the guild, right? Also, can someone escort me around the town? I'll get lost. The master stopped crying and nodded his head once in affirmation while jumping behind the bar counter. Makarov pulled out a book from a shelf and jumped back up to the bar counter and opened it. So, Naruto Uzumaki. This is just the basic stuff for getting initiated into the guild. Birthday, age, birth location, where you lived, your choice of magic and your abilities, and then comes whatever random information you want to throw in there. Usually one of the women would do this, but they're all knocked out. Naruto began to muse inside his head. He didn't want to give too much information and seemed suspicious as a 12-year-old, but if he had to, he needed some of his abilities. Taking a few moments to go through multiple possibilities and scenarios, Naruto had decided. For each of those in order, let's see. October 10th. I'm 12. Figure it out. Age. 12. Hehe. Birth location. No idea. Never figured that one out. Might have been a hospital or a forest for all I care. Where I live, I'll just stick under a rock for that. Makarov's sweat dropped, barely preventing himself from face faulting again. Naruto just put a finger to his chin as he looked up, taking up a thoughtful look. My magic abilities are clone magic, pure magic manipulation, seals, and wind. I don't want to give any other information. Too lazy, other people can figure it out. Besides, they should want to get to know me before they understand me. Makarov nodded his head as he wrote everything down, agreeing with Naruto's last assessment. He was a bit surprised by the versatility of the magics that the young teen had. Not only was it a versatile list, however, but it was amazingly well-rounded and surprisingly difficult. Clone magic, although not considered a lost magic, was extremely difficult to pull off at masterful levels. However, pure magic manipulation was something he had never heard of. It could possibly be a lost magic like Dragonslayer magic. I'm interested to see what it can do. Makarov thought to himself, mulling over the abilities and who the boy was. Naruto was inwardly cringing at himself. He noticed the way that the master seemed to narrow his eyes at the magics he named. Did I have the names of the magic wrong? No, he's writing them all down. But still, I think I said too much. Even in the elemental nations, having that many abilities would have been surprising, especially being able to use clones and chakra manipulation. Meh, we'll see what happens. Naruto waited for the master to finish, tapping his foot on the wooden floor. He crossed his arms and turned around to stare at the guild. It was a surprisingly nice building considering the fact that there were fights almost every day. He noticed that all the tables were wooden, which he immediately agreed with. If they were metal or made of a different material, maybe they wouldn't have broken, but it would have hurt a lot more if it hit someone. Also, it just didn't match the scheme of the building. Some girl with white hair was flaunting her recent victory in the bar fight, but that seemed to end when the red-haired girl with armor started fighting with her. The two had lightning cackling between their foreheads. Near the other end of the guild, the two boys that the redhead was manhandling had decided to duke it out again. Naruto chuckled. How they reminded him of Sasuke and himself in their early years. Okay, Naruto. Last thing is, where do you want your stamp and in what color? Naruto saw the fairy tale mark and immediately knew where he wanted it. It wouldn't feel right without some kind of mark there after having one his whole life. Orange, the blonde said as pointed to his stomach. Makarov nodded and stamped the mark in the middle of Naruto's stomach, right above the belly button. He didn't understand why the blonde would choose that, but he assumed it was something mental. With that, Makarov jumped back onto the counter and placed the book and stamp on said counter. Naruto, what do you mean by pure magic manipulation? You seem to be quite confident in your skills. Can you show me? Naruto gave the old master a smile before nodding his head. I'm not surprised. If I was the leader, I would probably ask that first as well. I think he's slightly suspicious, but not because he's suspicious that I have too much, but that I have too little. That's weird, but I'll go with it. Naruto laughed sheepishly as he scratched the back of his head. Anyo, do you mind if we do this somewhere else? I don't want to mess up your guild any more than it already is. Makarov, however, just told Naruto to go ahead. Nothing is going to mess it up more than it already is. Naruto tilted his head in confusion. The guild building could be destroyed. Makarov paled and immediately pulled the boy out the back door and into a clearing in a moment. Then, jumping high to a tree branch, Makarov gave Naruto the sign to demonstrate. Naruto just nodded, looking up at the master, before turning back to face the ground. Raising his fist, Naruto stared at it for a moment. My fist is so small compared to before. Meh, I don't have the chakra control that I did before. At max, it's at genin chakra control again. I'll just have to use all my remaining chakra to be able to do this even once, but I think I'll give Master Gigi-san a little scare with this one. He might start imagining me using this during bar fights. So predictable, hee. So, with that thought process out of the way, Naruto called onto his reserves and directed his chakra to his right fist. For a moment, nothing happened as the blonde raised his right fist over his head. Then it happened. Blue and golden chakra whisk out from his arm, then begin to coat his fist until it creates a sort of barrier coating. Then, the two different colored chakras began to mix, contesting for dominance on the fist. Naruto stayed still for a moment with his eyes closed before suddenly opening them with determination. RRAAAHH. The blonde yelled out as he brought his fist down upon the earth. Makarov was forced to jump away from his perching branch as the ground flew upwards, rocks and dirt flying everywhere. The master, as Naruto had expected, immediately began to pale from the prospect of the blonde using the ability inside the guild or any mission for that matter. The damage costs would be ridiculous. When the dust had settled, Makarov was shaken at the sight before him. Whatever had coated his arm had prevented any damage to the blonde's right arm. The whole clearing, nearly 20 meters long, had been replaced with a crater with the blonde at the bottom. However, the damage did not stop there, going further past the clearing and into part of the forest, toppling trees and shrubberies. It seems that the coating was pure magic manipulation. Amazing. For a child to use that kind of magic at such a young age, he would be truly powerful in only a few years. The blonde looked up from the epicenter of the crater and smiled at the master, giving the old man a thumbs up and an eye smile. When the blonde took his first step to go up the marred earth, he stumbled and fell to the ground from chakra exhaustion. Landing heavily, not even able to use his arms to soften the fall, Naruto crashed to the ground, raising a small cloud of dust. Meh, I don't think I've recovered completely yet. My reserves are so low right now, Naruto said seemingly to no one. Makarov jumped down and landed next to Naruto and picked the blonde up, making Naruto lean against the short master's shoulder. But still, that is very impressive, Naruto-chan. How many times do you think you would be able to do that in a fight? Naruto wasn't even able to move his legs from exhaustion, so his feet were dragging against the dirt and rocks on the ground. He lifted his head up slightly to the sky above, staring at the lazy clouds passing through in the sky. Maybe 5 or 6 times at most until my control improves. However, when I do, I can pretty much do anything with the manipulation. I can create small strings to grab onto things, create chains to prevent someone from moving, and a ton of other things as long as I can imagine it. Makarov smiled as he continued to drag the blonde towards the guild hall, opening the back door and taking the blonde inside. Throughout the whole guild hall, all of the members were still on the floor unconscious, either prone or face up. Some were in random positions. On the left side of the guild, there was a man-shaped hole, most likely where Elfman had hit the guild member. Are there any clothes? I don't really want to walk around in boxers when they wake up. Makarov chuckled and nodded his head. We have some clothes behind the bar counter that should be your size, which I find somewhat impressive. Naruto grunted in response, slightly annoyed by the master's small remark on Naruto's size and height. And where did they find clothing your size, Naruto replied teasingly. The master remained silent after that, a depressive rain cloud appearing over his head. Naruto began to yell at the master. Nani? Oi oi, don't get me wet with that cloud over your head. Hey! Stop it! Eventually, Naruto was dropped off at the bar counter stool, soaking wet in his boxers with no other clothing. I hate you, Naruto muttered, glaring lightly at the master that had jumped behind the bar counter to get some clothes. The blonde leaned against the counter and dropped his head on the counter. I noticed that the air all around me has an unknown energy that is the same as in my sewer. Does this mean that the people use the magic from the air, or do they have magic reserves as well? I'll find out eventually. But my reserves are filling pretty quickly, probably a secondary trait from having Kurama in my stomach for so long. My body isn't as stressed as it was before using my pure chakra manipulation, most likely a result of releasing the pent-up stress. Naruto sighed and pressed his cheek slightly harder against the cool surface, a welcome respite. A moment later, a light weight landed against the back of Naruto's head. The newly instated Fairy Tail Guild member lifted his head and grabbed the cloth on the back of his head. He stared at it with his cerulean eyes and was somewhat pleased to note that they were red and black, taking on the darker colors. Makarov jumped back onto the counter and pointed at the clothes Naruto was now holding in his hands. Those are new clothes that were never used. Wear them and buy some clothes from one of the stores in town. Naruto raised his head and glanced at the master before looking back down at the clothing again, noticing the dust and wrinkles on the clothing. Do you mean new when you say it has been untouched for like 10 years? Makarov ignored the question and continued speaking. You should probably go to town with Cana or one of the younger guild members. Cana would probably be the best though. Naruto faced the guild master and kept a steady gaze on the master as their conversation began. I don't know who Cana is. Can you describe her? She was wearing a sundress. Cool. You narrowed it down to 2 of the girls. Blue or brown hair? Makarov raised his eyebrows. Inwardly, he was shocked, a clear difference from his outward expression. He has a surprisingly good eye. To be able to remember that kind of information from watching a bar fight just once is not genius, however. It means he's used to gathering information and important details around him quickly. What has he gone through to be able to do that so effectively? Instead of voicing out his thoughts, Makarov continued, deciding to ask the blonde when the 2 were closer, most likely at a much later date. Brown hair. She uses cards for her magic. Naruto nodded his head before smirking. The one that threw cards to hit the lights above people's heads, right? Makarov nodded slowly, sad to note that there would be even more expenses to repair the building. Naruto got off of his stool, feeling much better with only 5 minutes of rest. It seems that high-speed regeneration was another thing that he had inherited from Kurama. As Naruto walked around the guild hall looking for the girl that Makarov had recommended, the guild master took the time to think to himself since he was finally alone. His power is extremely high, and he seems intelligent. That already is quite a fearsome combination, unlike Natsu who is mainly power and all brawn. I don't know how bad his control or how fast he is, but his muscles and body type indicate he is capable of going into a battle of attrition with no qualms and is heavily based on speed. So, speed, power, and intelligence. Finally, he is aware of his surroundings. Add that all together, and we have one very scary mage. Currently, I would put him at high B class, possibly low A class, but I don't have enough information to make any realistic conclusions. It seems that we may have another Urza or Mira in the guild. Makarov smiled before a feeling of dread went through his body, remembering the demonstration Naruto had shown him only minutes before. But he's as destructive as Natsu. Oh, this will be so bad. What will I have to tell the council? The council, oh no. Unaware of Makarov's current inner musings and feelings of dread, Naruto was cheerfully looking for any young girl his age that was currently on the floor knocked out. Eventually, he found the person that he assumed was Cana. The girl had her hair up in a ponytail, showing off her forehead proudly. He was quick to admit to himself that she was prettier than Sakura and had much more natural beauty than Ino had in her early years. She'll probably be even hotter than Mei-chan sometime in the future. Shaking his head to get rid of his random thoughts from his past, Naruto leaned down next to the girl and shook her to wake her up. When that elicited no response, he shook again, only with slightly more violence. Again, it had no effect. Naruto stared at the girl before moving from her side so that he was now straddling the girl. Then, he leaned down until he was inches from her face. Makarov, who saw only the last action, was suddenly interested with a perverse expression on his face. Go, Naruto-chan. I know you can do it, he cheered silently, rooting on the blonde. Naruto sneezed to the side, shaking the girl again, but she still didn't wake up from her knocked-out state. Again, Naruto leaned close to her, his hands on her cheeks. Suddenly, he pinched both of her cheeks and spread them out to epic proportions. Wake up, Cana, he yelled. That got the girl to wake up. She immediately began to bring herself up, only to meet with Naruto's forehead. Her speed increased since Naruto was keeping her lower body still, making it easier for her to make the sit-up movement. Itai, Cana rubbed her forehead with one of her hands, the other one the ground to support her. Naruto got off of her and smirked at her when she glared up at the blonde. And who are you? I'm Naruto Uzumaki, a new member of Fairy Tail. Cana's hostile expression immediately changed to one of blatant curiosity with an undercurrent of clear happiness. Naruto leaned down to give the girl a hand, which she took without a moment's hesitation to pull herself up. When she had patted herself down and looked up to stare at the blonde, Naruto gave her a wide, foxy smile. Nice to meet you. Cana said that you know the town's layout and the stores for clothing. Cana nodded her head eagerly, always willing to make another friend to add into her already growing list. Okay, then can you take me around the town and show me some shops, please? Master, put some money in the pockets of these pants so that I can buy some new clothes. Cana nodded again happily before taking the lead, walking out of the guild. Naruto chuckled before following, passing by the two boys that once again got manhandled by the redhead. They both stared at him with a pleading expression. Naruto just smiled at both of them and gave them a wave before turning around to follow Cana, who was already getting ahead. Who was he? Natsu asked. Gray shook his head in confusion. No talking. You two fought again, Urza said strictly as she pointed her sword at the two. The two boys lifted their hands over their heads in the universal sign of surrender. But you fight with Mira all the time. Both of them thought in unison. Naruto was currently walking around the town with Cana in clear happiness, his smile growing wider and wider as he continued to walk around the town. People waved to him, to which he happily waved back. Girls and some women squealed at how happy and childish the blonde looked, turning around and smiling at every noticeable thing about the town. Cana took a small pleasure from watching the blonde's facial expressions. You've never been to the town of Magnolia. Naruto took a moment to glance at her and shake his head before continuing to admire all the shops and buildings. Cana laughed before moving next to him and patting the blonde's shoulder. Well then, welcome to Magnolia, she said happily. Naruto turned to her again and gave her a wide smile, which she returned. Eventually, they reached a shop that Cana had recommended. Naruto stared at the shop before taking a few steps backwards to backtrack. Cana, however, was taking none of that and grabbed onto the blonde's wrist to prevent him from running. Naruto stared at her frightfully before looking up at the title of shop. Ca Cana. This doesn't look like a store for boys. Cana smiled before tugging on his wrist to move him closer to the entrance of the clothing store. I know that Heart Cruise is mainly a women's store, but there are some pretty decent clothes for men, too. So don't worry and let's go. Cana said happily, excited at the prospect of possibly buying some clothes. Urza had bought some pretty nice clothes which made Cana interested in the brand. Naruto had shown her the amount of jewels that Master had given to him, and it was clearly enough to pay for at least 5 sets of normal clothes, which would be enough for 2 sets from Heart Cruise. Makarov was probably expecting a decent amount of change back after Naruto had gone shopping. Sorry, Master. My fortune-telling ability says that you won't have any change back today. Cana thought cheekily to herself as he opened the doors to the store. As soon as the door opened, Naruto cringed and gulped. Every customer in the shop, at least 20 women and young girls in their teens, turned to the entrance and zoomed in on the blonde who was still being held on the wrist. Naruto stared fearfully back at the crowd of women that zoned in on him before screaming at the top of his lungs. X Shuya X. Time skip. 1 hour. I don't care what you say, Cana. I'm never going back to the store ever again. Cana just laughed with happiness, holding a bag which held 2 sets of clothing, one for Naruto and one for her. Naruto had changed into new clothes, now wearing black pants that went down to his shins. On his upper body, he was wearing a dark orange shirt with a spiral in the front. Over his shirt was a white jacket with a cross that leaned furthermore on the right side of his chest. All in all, Naruto looked much neater and better than before entering the store, except for the sour expression on his face that clearly said, "I'm not amused." I'm sorry, Naruto-chan. Cana said, drawing out on the suffix, copying the women inside the store. Naruto cringed before turning his head to glare lightly at the brunette. That's not funny. You owe me, Cana. Cana just chuckled happily with an innocent look on her face. Naruto lost his sour expression and smiled brightly as well when he saw how her expression showed her complete happiness and glee with an innocence that anyone would want to protect. Obviously, Naruto would be included in this list. He would do anything to help someone that was innocent to stay that way, especially after what he had to go through in just 6 years of working as a professional ninja. Fine, fine. What do you want? Naruto turned his head away from the girl and stared straight forwards. The streets of the town were now mainly crowded since it was approaching rush hour. The sun was high, but it wasn't hot since it was approaching winter, a light wind passing through the town. Tell me about your magic. Cana instantly brightened up before explaining about her cards. I use cards as my main magic. I'm able to place runes onto my cards so that they can have multiple results. For example, I can make a combination of cards to make a tornado. Or I can just place magic into my custom deck of cards to make them into weapons that become kind of like shurikens. Naruto nodded his head, seeing the usefulness of her magic. How about you, Naruto? The blonde turned to her slightly surprised. He was expecting her to ask, but not that forwardly. They had just met and she was already treating him kindly, as if she wanted to become closer to him so that they could be friends as soon as possible. Then, Naruto smiled and veered off the cobblestone path, walking towards a forest at the edge of a town that Cana had pointed out beforehand. The mages trained in any part of the forest, but there were set areas. Kind of like the training grounds back at home. Naruto thought to himself with a bit of nostalgia. Where are you going? Cana asked from behind Naruto, but she already knew he was going to the forest. Naruto turned his head around to face her and smiled over his shoulder. You said you wanted to see my magic, right? Let me show you a little trick that might seem similar to yours. Cana perked up at that and increased her pace, now walking next to the blonde. Eventually, the two reached a clearing in the forest where Naruto stopped at. Cana stopped next to him, waiting eagerly for the demonstration that the blonde would show. What magic does he have that's similar to him? As Cana watched the blonde, Naruto seemed to make a strange motion as a cloud of smoke suddenly covered his hand. When the smoke had cleared, there was a strange rectangular paper held between his fingers. Cana looked at it and widened her eyes. That's like the runes on my cards, she exclaimed. Naruto smirked before shaking his head lightly. I told you that it was similar, Cana. Now let me show you something that you can add to your repertoire of abilities. Then, the blonde turned around to make his back face the brunette before narrowing his eyes in concentration. I pulled out one of my more basic tags, so this should be able to work even with my shoddy chakra control right now. Okay, let's show Cana some real tricks. Naruto pumped a small amount of chakra to start the timer on the tag, but it didn't light. Continuously pumping minute amounts of chakra into the tag, it began to straighten until it became hard and sturdy, almost like a card. Then, Naruto suddenly threw it with unnatural accuracy, the card slicing through the air and grooving itself deeply into the trunk of a tree vertically. Cana stared at the card for a moment, and then exhaled in disappointment. Naruto turned around his body to face her and smiled at her disappointed face. I wouldn't stop watching if I were you. Naruto raised his right hand to about shoulder level and snapped his finger, flaring his chakra lightly at the same time. Suddenly, the card exploded, destroying the tree and sending the tree flying high into the air before crashing back down to the earth. Cana stared, gaping at the event that had just occurred before her. Then, she shifted her position slightly so that she was staring slack-jawed at the blonde who was just staring at her with a sheepish grin. I'm definitely adding that to my skill set. Naruto chuckled as he scratched the back of his head and began to walk away from the forest. Cana immediately joined Naruto, contently walking next to the blonde. Hey, want to do a mission with me? Cana asked. She was surprised to find a person that used similar magic to her and wanted to see what else the blonde could do. Not only that, but the blonde was extremely open and was so happy and was so welcome to questions that she found herself quickly warming up to the blonde. Are missions the same here as they are in the elemental nations? Naruto thought to himself. However, he decided to just go ahead without thinking about it for just this once. If it's a mission, then it shouldn't be too bad since Gigi-san probably won't give us something too difficult, especially since we're still young. However, he might make us make up our deficit in skill by increasing our numbers, although I don't really need the backup. Naruto threw away the thought of taking a mission solo and decided to agree with Cana. After all, she seemed to be a nice girl and was kind to him so far, trying to act as hospitable and kind as possible to a boy that had crashed into their guild building. Sure. Let's go back to the guild. X Shuya X. Location: Fairy Tale Guild Hall. Gray, you're not wearing clothes again, Cana said as soon as she walked through the doors. Said boy immediately looked down at himself before cursing and looking for his clothes on the floor. Again. Naruto thought to himself as he chuckled at the antics of the guild members. Suddenly, the girl with red hair that was previously manhandling Gray And the pink-haired teen around Naruto's age was in front of Naruto with her hand extended. Naruto stared at the hand before looking up at the girl. She had an expectant look on her face. Her hair was tied in a long ponytail that ran down her back. Instead of clothing, she was wearing armor on her upper body and a skirt on her lower body. I heard that you're a new member. My name is Urza Scarlet, Urza said to Naruto. The blonde moved forwards and shook her hand and smiled at her. I'm Naruto Uzumaki. Nice to meet you, Urza. The blonde said. If this were the elemental nations, no one would have introduced themselves like this. If it was before the battle against Pain, people would be discriminating against him. If it was after, they would flatter him to the point it was almost worship, something that Naruto did not appreciate. He wanted respect, not hero worship. Good. Well then, I expect you to follow the rules and not create too much trouble. Naruto nodded his head mechanically in response. As soon as Urza left him and Cana alone, the two of them began to laugh to themselves. Fairy tale members not making trouble. Who heard of that before? After Urza had gone off to somewhere else, another girl walked up to Naruto with another girl and the tall man that was able to transform his arm. Closer up, he realized it was the girl who won the recent bar fight and that the guy was much younger than he expected. He was just ridiculously tall. Don't talk to that bitch. By the way, my name is Mira Strauss. The girl in the front said. Naruto quickly deduced that she was the leader of their trio. The smaller girl next to her, Naruto assumed her younger sister, said something to Mira but the elder sister just waved it off and ignored it. Who's the girl you don't like? Naruto asked, using a euphemism. Mira turned back, facing Cana first before turning to Naruto. Hey, Cana. I'll be seeing you in the S-class exams next year, won't I? Then, Mira faced Naruto with a glance that told Naruto she was one of those condescending girls with an ego, a trait that Naruto would beat out of her if no one else did. Urza Scarlet. She's a complete bitch. Don't talk to her, she said in a commanding tone. Naruto noticed the sound of a sword swinging and immediately ducked. Suddenly, Urza was in front of Mira with her sword drawn, which Mira stopped by grabbing onto the swordswoman's wrist. Did you call me a bitch, you skank? Urza said. Mira glared at the red-haired swordswoman before spitting at her. Naruto sighed. He didn't want to see another bar fight on his fight day after joining the guild. The two of you have so much animosity towards each other. The two turned to him as one and glared at him. Stay out of this, they said at the same time. Instead of responding, Naruto cleaned out his left ear with his pinky and stared at the two girls blankly. Then, he said, I'm sorry, did you say something to me? I hope I didn't miss anything important now. Well, I'm off to meet some more of the welcoming and kind. See you too, Naruto said as he brushed past the two. Cana was staring in shock, watching Naruto walk away. Natsu and Gray, who were watching together without fighting for once, began to fear for the new guild member's life. He's going to die, they thought in unison. The two rivals stared at each other behind, nodding their heads and jumping after the blonde. Right before they reached him, however, the sound of a snap was heard and the two girls both dropped to the floor in a heavy heap, dropping uselessly to the ground. Both of them tried to get up, but they couldn't for some reason. Something was pressing down on them and it was heavy as hell. Cana, who was watching from a short distance from behind, was probably the only one who understood what had just happened, since she had an inkling of an idea of what Naruto could do with his magic. What kind of rune magic was that? Was it his rune magic again? But I only saw him drop 2 papers, the brunette thought to herself. However, to anyone else, it just seemed as if the blonde had snapped his fingers and the 2 had dropped as the result of his snap. Absurd as it sounds, magic was magic. There were dragon slayers, weren't there? Naruto turned around and walked back to the girls, glaring at the 2. Then, He bent down on his knees so that the height difference wasn't so much that the girls were easily able to glare up at him. Suddenly, Naruto smiled, completely breaking the tense atmosphere. Good job, you two. Using teamwork to get at a common enemy and striking when he didn't seem prepared. Good job. Pass. Naruto said cheerfully, giving the two a thumbs up. The two just stared at him for a moment, completely bewildered. Why was he not annoyed that they tried to attack him when he was turned around? Wait. You're not mad they tried to attack you when you weren't prepared? Naruto looked up and faced Cana as he shook his head. No, why should I be? This is fairy tale, and from what I see, you guys fight all the time. If I say that you can't strike my back, wouldn't that make me a hypocrite? Use whatever advantage you can get, that's what I would do. Besides, I'm not as strong as you two, someone coughed from the bar counter. Nor am I as skilled as you, another cough from the same person. Naruto's right eyebrow twitched in annoyance as he finished his last statement. But if you let anyone have a plan or set up something, you're screwed. What a man. The third member of the white-haired family said. Naruto shuddered slightly before turning around and walking away, but he didn't let up on his gravity seal. The two girls continued to struggle to get back on their feet but failed. Cana stared at the two before hesitatingly passing them and joining up with Naruto, who was now staring at the mission board. Hey, fight me. Someone said to Naruto's right. Naruto turned from the board to the loud voice and saw the pink-haired mage. He turned back to the board and said in an apathetic voice, later. After I finish a mission with Cana. Natsu, who saw what Naruto had done, although still confused by how he did it, decided that was as good as a promise. However, he wanted to get to know the new guy better, so. Hey, let me join in on the mission. Natsu said. Naruto stayed silent for a moment before responding with a smile at the Dragon Slayer. Sure, the more the merrier. Why not? Sweet. The Dragon Slayer said with a smile. May I join as well? Another person asked. Naruto turned to his right again and saw the boy that was constantly stripped. He had already lost his shirt and pants. Naruto pointed at him and said, your clothes, which resulted in the boy looking down at himself and cursing again. However, he didn't leave immediately, staring at the blonde waiting for a response. Yes, you can join, too. Hey, who said you can join, Gray? Natsu said, irritated that Gray would be on the same mission as he would be. He did. Didn't you just hear him? Gray responded in an equally annoyed tone before walking away to find his lost clothing. Cana, who was currently to Naruto's left, stared at the paper Naruto had just taken from the board. Giving it a once-over, she nodded before taking it from his hands and then going over to the bar counter. Master, we'd like to take this mission. The group comprises Cana Alberona, Gray Fullbuster, Natsu Dragneel, and Naruto Uzumaki. Makarov placed his cup of beer to the side and took the mission request before stamping it and handing it back to Cana. Be careful, he said to Naruto, Cana, and Natsu, since Gray was still somewhere in the guild looking for his clothes. Natsu and Naruto both smirked as they gave him a thumbs up while Cana only gave a serious nod of the head before the trio turned around to exit the hall. When they were walking towards the entrance to start their mission, Gray had joined them, now fully clothed. Only when they had exited the guild building did Naruto snap his finger again to release his gravity seal to get rid of the weight on top of Urza and Mira. For once, they decided to get over their hatred of each other to get the new blonde member back with a vengeance, but you don't get the drop on the king of pranking. You can try, but he'll just bring hell back with him. I know the difference between an A- class and an S-class mage. It is 18 letters. Natsu Dragneel. What's wrong with him? Naruto asked, pointing at Natsu. The Dragon Slayer was currently laying down on the train seat, taking up all the space on one side, forcing the other three to take the opposite end of the seats. Don't worry. It'll fade eventually. It's just a side effect of his magic, Gray said, replying to Naruto's question. The blonde raised his eyebrows as he continued to stare at Natsu, the pink-haired mage moaning in pain and complaining about how all transportation was uncomfortable. That's interesting. What is his magic in the first place? Naruto asked curiously. Fire Dragon Slayer magic, Gray said immediately, but nothing more than that. Naruto turned his head to face the black-haired mage that was currently sitting to his left. Okay, then. Well, since Natsu is out of it, how about we three introduce ourselves to each other? Naruto said. Before Gray or Cana could ask how to introduce themselves, which Naruto knew they would ask based on experience, he continued. For example, we can talk about our likes, dislikes, hobbies, goals, and then our magic. I'll go first, Gray said, raising his hand slightly over his shoulder. Without waiting for confirmation, since he knew this was mainly a formality to get to know Naruto better, he began. My name is Gray Fullbuster. I like the cold and my magic. I dislike, well not dislike, okay, yay, I dislike Natsu. My hobby is to practice my ice make magic and my goal is to become the best ice make mage in all of Fury so that I can do something. Also, I want to make that stubborn Natsu admit that I am better than he is. Naruto nodded his head and gave Gray a smile, although he was laughing inwardly at Gray's last goal. Nice to meet you, Gray. I guess I'll go next. Naruto took a deep breath before starting. My name is Naruto Uzumaki. My hobbies are ramen, training, and my precious people. I dislike the time it takes to cook ramen and ghosts, hee. My hobbies are gardening and meditating occasionally. My goals. Meh. As for my magic, clone magic, pure magic manipulation, runes, and wind. Naruto said, finishing his introduction. I told the Master Seals, but he probably assumed I meant runes. If I'm correct here, the two should be about the same or one should be derived from the other. We'll see. How do you know so many? I thought you were mainly a runes person, Cana said with some surprise evident in her voice. Gray was also curious as to why the blonde knew so many different magical abilities. Unlike most mages, the blonde did not seem to focus on one magic. But his short demonstration showed that he was a master of runes. Both Cana and Gray thought at the same time, thinking of two different events. Cana was thinking about the explosive tag while Gray was recalling the moment Naruto dropped two gravity seals onto the ground and activated them when Mira and Urza had jumped after him. Naruto waved his hand, leaning back against the cushion of the chair. I just feel safer knowing more. Besides, it helps a lot that my clone magic has a special benefit attached to it. The other two waited for a moment for Naruto to explain, but when he didn't, they left him be. Then, Cana coughed into her fist and began her introduction. My full name is Cana Alberona. My likes are my guild and my friends. I dislike, I'm going to copy you Naruto and say, meh. Naruto stuck his tongue out at the girl. My hobby is fortune telling with my cards, and my magic, as you already know, is card magic. Naruto opened his eyes and turned over to Cana, curiosity clearly shown in his eyes. However, he remained silent and turned his head straight forwards, mainly looking at the suffering figure of Natsu. Well, it's nice to meet you all, especially you, Natsu, the blonde said. The pink-haired dragon slayer just moaned in response, writhing in his seat. X Shuya X. Location. Bathroom. Naruto splashed his face with water and looked up, staring at his reflection in the mirror. However, instead of the 12-year-old figure of himself staring back at the blonde, his 18-year-old self, the face caked with dirt and bruises, stared back at him. It's strange how I'm not surprised I'm in another dimension. It's like, I'm just going with it. But something's bugging me. No matter how I act right now, it feels weird. I try to act like a 13 or 12-year-old but, I guess I'm still a veteran of war. I wonder how long it'll be until I reach the point before I leave the elemental nation. Chakra control was shot. Let's see, my optical nerves should be about the same as before I left, but the speed at which my body responds might be slower since I didn't train much in my younger years. I'm glad I left about 200 clones back in the forest to train my chakra control. But I won't be able to use Sage mode since this body, well, it's just not ready for it yet. Neither is it prepared for a complete Biju mode either yet, at least another year until I can even use an incomplete Kyuubi chakra mode, not even close to Biju mode. Suddenly, Naruto stumbled slightly when the train stopped without any warning, making the blonde grab onto the sink to prevent himself from falling over. What the hell? Naruto said when the train had completely stopped. He unlocked the bathroom door and ran out, rushing from his spot from the bathroom back to his new teammates, passing passengers as he went down the aisle. What's going on? He asked as soon as he reached his seats. Cana and Gray were picking up Natsu in a fireman's hold and were about to run down the aisle to exit the train. Mages blew up the tracks. We can't move, so everyone is forced to go out, Cana said, although she was focusing more on Natsu who was groaning even more when he was picked up. They're demanding that the passengers give them all their money and whatever valuables they have, Gray finished for Cana. Naruto remained silent, a clear difference from what he was thinking. Of course this happens on my first mission. Just my luck, Naruto thought to himself. However, what Gray said next made him question his original assessment about his luck. This happens every time Natsu goes on a mission, somehow, he's a trouble magnet. Doesn't matter. Hurry up and let's get off the train. We have some pesky mages to deal with. Cana said quickly. When the group of 4 was outside, they were exposed to the sight of the explosion. Naruto and his group zoned in on the mages. Give all of your valuables and money to us and we'll leave you off, without too much pain. Cana and Gray immediately scrunched their eyebrows. Gray began to grit his teeth in anger at the 12 obviously dark mages standing before them. He dropped Natsu to the ground ceremonially on his bottom and stood straight up, stretching out his neck as he clicked his tongue, preparing to use his ice make magic to fight. Naruto stared at the 12 dark mages and felt that out of the 12, only one of them was strong enough to be of any consequence. He was probably somewhere around A class from what Naruto could feel. The rest were cannon fodder, however, that still meant they had the strength in numbers. Not only that, but add the innocent bystanders to the equation, then the situation gets ugly. Well, if they want to play a numbers game, I can win that any day. But what can I do that would make this simple and clean? Ah, misdirection. Naruto smirked. He never thought he would do this, but it seemed that the time called for it. Desperate times called for desperate measures, right? He walked forwards with no reserves or any hesitation to his walk. Gray and Cana whispered for him to stop and read the situation, but Naruto continued to move closer to the dark mages and the front of the crowd of passengers, giving his 2 conscious teammates a smile before changing his expression to one of seriousness. What are you doing? Give us everything ya got. One of the mages yelled at the frightened crowd. The mages were getting irritated that none of the passengers were moving forwards or even making any action to reach for their valuables. However, they weren't afraid to use force or cause just a little bit of death. No, to get what they wanted, they weren't afraid to kill. Suddenly, the crowd started to move and split apart. The mages assumed it was the leader and waited. However, when the leader reached the front, it was revealed to be a blonde child that stood at less than 5 feet tall. The blonde had a look of determination on his face as he crossed his arms off his chest and stared at each of the opposing mages without backing down for a moment, making the mages question who the child was. Who are you, ya little brat? Naruto growled at the remark on his height before he smirked. That was the question he was waiting for. He brought his hands into a cross position and used one of his signature techniques. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. he said mentally. A cloud of smoke surrounded the blonde. When the wind cleared the smoke, 12 identical blondes were revealed surrounding the original caster. The dark mages took a step back in surprise except for the experienced one that was confident in his skills. After all, the blonde was only a child. Numbers did nothing if there was no skill to back it up. However, instead of attacking, the 12 clones of the blondes sat on the ground and each brought out a traditional instrument out of nowhere. Then, they began to play some strange kabuki beat as the original began to hop on one foot, and then switched to his other foot. I am the most unpredictable mage. My very name brings fear into the depths of the heart of my foes and enemies. I am revered everywhere, the fact that all opponents bow before me is the reason for my fame. Suddenly, all of the dark mages suddenly fell to the ground in a useless heap, an extremely heavy weight pressing down on each of their backs. Naruto, however, ignored their now vulnerable states and continued his ridiculous introduction. While they were focusing on the blonde and smoke beforehand, Naruto had created 13 clones, not 12. People assume that my clones have to be close to me, such a stupid assumption. He thought to himself as he hopped again to his left foot. I am the great mage, Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto finished with a flourish, whipping his head in a circle and throwing his right hand in front of him and his left arm behind his back. Naruto completely copied the pose of Ero Sennin when he first met the perverted sage. All of the backup clones finished their instrumental introduction and bowed at the end. Cana, Gray, and even the barely conscious Natsu sweat dropped at Naruto's introduction. The amount of stupidity Naruto was acting with in this situation, however, made them wonder how he could remain so calm and take a situation like this as a joke. The rest of the dark mages on the floor were sweating in fear. They were completely vulnerable and had no idea why they were having so much difficulty to even move their body an inch upwards. Suddenly, Naruto turned around and pointed at one of the clones as he began to berate it. You missed the G note at the 13th measure. What are you doing? The clone bowed humbly as an apology. Sorry, boss. It won't happen again. The original Naruto kept his serious face as he continued to castigate the clone. It better not happen again. The rest of you, though, good job. Dismissed. As one, all of the clones bowed before disappearing out of existence in a cloud of smoke. How? Naruto turned around and smiled condescendingly at the downed mages. Cana, Gray, and a fully recovered Natsu were now listening attentively, also wanting to know how Naruto had taken care of the dark mages so easily. Instead of responding, Naruto reached into his pocket and pulled out a paintbrush. Ah, the paintbrush is so overpowered. Do you know what this baby can do? Naruto stared lovingly at the paintbrush. Every single person present, downed mages, passengers, and Naruto's teammates alike all sweat dropped at the antics of the strange blonde. Suddenly, Naruto began to swing his paintbrush in the air in calculated movements. All the mages on the dirty ground watched in apprehension, but their concentration was broken when all 12 of them suddenly fell asleep. Naruto stared at each of the unconscious dark mages, each of them unmoving. Then he turned around to the flabbergasted viewers and tilted his head. I can't torture or interrogate them, can I? They all shook their heads as another sweat drop went down the back of their heads. Well, there goes that choice. A few minutes later, a group of rune knights came in and handcuffed the dark mages before taking them away. Shuya X. Time skip. 4 hours. Natsu kicked the door down with his foot and cheerfully walked into the guild hall. We're back. A few of the mages welcomed Fairy Tail's Dragonslayer back, giving him claps on the back or some form of welcome. Naruto, Cana, and Gray quickly followed. The expression on Naruto's face was complete apathy for anything. Although the mission wasn't bad, he was expecting a little bit more from a B-ranked mission. Simply finding a person, getting their item and dropping it off at another location was not considered a B-ranked mission. Cana and Gray, on the other hand, were happily chatting away with each other, talking about their recent success on their mission. Further on in the mission, the four-man group had run into a few bandits and had taken care of them with ease. While Naruto was doing his distracting and ridiculous introduction again, Natsu had charged in and attacked the distracted opponents, knocking out a number of the opponents before Gray and Cana joined in. After they had defeated all of them, Naruto continued to do his introduction until he finished, uncaring of the fact that all of the opponents were down and that no one was listening to him anymore. It was a perfect form of distraction and misdirection. Suddenly, Naruto ducked and threw two papers into the air above his head and snapped his fingers immediately. Then, taking one step to the left, the sound of a heavy landing was heard perfectly clearly in his ears where he had stood just a moment before. The blonde looked down at the floor to his right and found Mira on the floor, struggling to stand up again. "Hi there, Mira. How's the weather down there?" Naruto asked cheekily, his eyes closed as he gave the white-haired girl an eye smile. She growled back at Naruto on the floor in response. Naruto looked up and turned around in a full circle, taking in his surroundings, looking for a certain red-haired swordswoman in armor. However, in a moment, Mira had jumped up and punched Naruto in the face, sending the blonde flying. Mira smirked as she felt her fist impact the smirking blonde's face, only to drop her smile when she saw his body disappear in a cloud of smoke. I don't think that's very nice, a taunting voice said from behind her. Mira whirled around and was exposed to the sight of Urza on the floor struggling under one of the blonde's damned runes again. Naruto took a step forwards closer to the white-haired girl before dropping into a random stance in the middle of the guild hall, the complete center of attention. Everyone's eyes were on the two. This was something that never happened before, someone actually forcing the two rivals to team up and still beat them while teasing them. Mira snarled at the blonde as she transformed slightly. Naruto shook his head as she charged straight forwards at him at a high speed. Mira felt the impact of her fist dig into the blonde's face again, but that feeling quickly changed to emptiness. Looking at what her fist impacted, it was covered by a cloud and a piece of paper floating in the air that had just attached to her fist. Mira dropped to the ground as she was brought down to earth unceremoniously by the gravity seal. She looked up to find the blonde and found him carrying an unmoving Urza on his shoulder over to her. Urza was glaring at Naruto but couldn't move any portion of her body other than her eyes. When the blonde came to Mira, he picked her up and placed her over his shoulder as well and walked over to a table and placed the two on the chairs of the table. Your teamwork was better. It was a good plan to sacrifice one of you to prevent one from getting affected by the gravity rune, so that the other could remove it later on like you did, but if this was in the real world, the person that sacrificed herself would either be unconscious or dead. But otherwise, better. Naruto said cheerfully. The two girls continued to glare hatefully at the blonde. The majority of the guild just stared slack-jawed. The blonde had single-handedly taken care of two of Fairy Tail's upper class of mages, both of them standing at low A class. And it was done with only two abilities. Makarov, who saw this, was deeply interested in how much the blonde knew about runes. He was able to make the conclusion that the blonde was extremely aware as well as highly intelligent, or was just very good at strategic planning on the spot. However, the mood suddenly tensed when Naruto dropped his smile and said his next words. But for failing, you two have to be punished. So, the whole guild watched as Naruto dug into his pocket and pulled out a paintbrush. Then, he dipped it with ink from nowhere and began to draw on the faces of the two girls, drawing 3 whiskers on each cheek. There. You two look so much better. Naruto said in a cheerful tone and then walked away without removing his gravity rune. The surprise from the guild increased, although now they were barely holding in their laughter. One person cracked, and then the rest of the guild joined in, guffawing and laughing without control. If the two girls were mad at the blonde before, Now they were leaking killing intent in his direction with so much force that if it were any other male, he would have been running for his life. However, Naruto wasn't normal and was used to such flimsy killing intent that he waved it off as he joined his mission teammates at the bar counter who were reporting to the master, who seemed to be crying out of happiness. Did something good happen to you, master? Makarov wiped his tears with his hand as he nodded his head. It's a miracle. For the first time, Natsu, Gray, and Cana have reported that they have done no damage during their mission. Makarov opened his eyes and gripped Naruto's shoulders and began to shake the blonde. I beg of you, please continue to take missions with them. Okay. Geez. Calm down, Gigi-san, Naruto said, grabbing the old man's wrists and lifting them off his shoulders. No wonder Naruto could never act seriously. It was because no one else in the whole guild was ever serious, well except for Urza and maybe Mira. But I expect something back, Naruto said immediately. Free apartment room in a nice complex, the master said without hesitation. He would save huge sums of money and get a load of his back from the council at the same time. If Naruto could deal with the three of them during missions, it would definitely be worth the price of paying for the blonde's living costs. Deal, Naruto said immediately. He didn't need any fancy living conditions. He lived his whole life in an apartment where he was cheated and sometimes even thrown out. Fight me, Naruto. You said you would. Natsu said, suddenly turning on the blonde with his fists aflame. Naruto turned to the Dragon Slayer and nodded his head. Natsu's challenge had gotten the interest of the guild, and now that the blonde had nodded his head, the guild members' interest had gone to a new high. They had only seen him use clones and runes. A true assessment of what the blonde could do was just something the members wanted to see, although they admitted to themselves it would be unlikely if the blonde could deal with both Urza and Mira at the same time with little difficulty. I did say I would. Where do you want to do it? In the back of the guild is fine. Let's go. I'm all fired up, Natsu said in excitement as he began to walk towards the back door of the guild. Wait. Are you Naruto? The blonde stopped and turned around to see a girl in a sundress with blue hair staring up at him, two other boys standing next to her protectively. They gave Naruto a wary look before relaxing slightly. I am. Why? The girl lifted up the seal that Naruto had used on Urza and Mira and pointed at it. Naruto took a moment to look past the girl and saw that Urza and Mira were walking around again freely, although they did send a few predatory glares at him every once in a while. Naruto gave both of them a smile and a wave before focusing back on the girl before him. Nice to meet you, Naruto. It's good to have another member in our guild. My name is Levi Magarden. The blue-haired girl said cheerfully, a bright smile on her face. Naruto smiled back at her as he waited for her to get to the point of what she wanted with him. Again, she pointed at the seal that Naruto had used. This is an ancient rune, right? Naruto tilted his head in confusion. Okay, I know runes are similar to seals. Cool. But I've never heard of ancient runes. Then again, I've only been here for at most a day. Naruto thought to himself. Levi shook her head before taking on a thoughtful look. Natsu, however, was getting impatient, his adrenaline rushing through his body for his fight. Come on, Levi. Can't you wait until after I beat him? Naruto fought the urge to scoff. The amount that Natsu reminded Naruto of his younger self was ridiculous. Headstrong jumps into the fray first and thinks later, ridiculously enthusiastic, loyal to a fault, and many other traits that just made him see himself in Natsu. However, Levi did rebuke Natsu for him in a way with the next thing she said. She turned to Natsu and said, I don't mean to seem mean or anything, Natsu, but if I am correct, currently, you don't stand a chance. Remember that he beat Mira and Urza by himself, who are both able to beat you. Not only that, but, Levi turned back to Naruto and continued. I think if I recall correctly from a book I read, another name for the ancient rune magic was, It was Funjutsu. Levi exclaimed in her sudden recollection. Naruto widened his eyes in slight surprise. They know what real seals are here. But I thought everything here was based on magic. Wait, no. Seals aren't completely based on chakra. It can be fueled by any kind of energy as long as the person knows the kanji and letters for the seal. What's the difference? They're the same thing, aren't they? One has letters, the other has letters, no difference. Natsu said impatiently, clearly not getting the point. Levi shook her head and pointed at Naruto. Runes originated from the ancient runes, which are the seals Naruto uses. However, they are much more complicated and potent, despite how complicated our runes already look. And if I am correct again, you used a gravity seal, which is one of the most difficult seals to use, with almost perfect ease. That means you're a seal master, right? Shit. I knew I should have held back on that. Why the hell do I have to get caught by someone that actually reads history and knows about something that no one else knows? Naruto thought, chastising himself for his carelessness. It had only been a day, and here, he was already getting caught with his use of seals. I thought something was strange when you said that you used seals instead of runes, the master said, pitching in his own thoughts. The old man turned to Natsu and pointed at the back door and said, "Go and fight Naruto. It'll be a good experience and you'll learn something." Naruto stared at the old man in shock, and then he smirked, realizing the old man's intentions. Makarov knew exactly how to teach Natsu, a hands-on experience. Natsu was like Naruto when he was younger, they both learned by practical experience. Finally, let's do this. Natsu exclaimed as he ran out the back door, his fists blazing once more. Naruto chuckled mentally as he followed the eager Natsu out the back door. Makarov hopped off of his seat on top of the bar counter and followed immediately behind Naruto. Slowly, the rest of the guild came out, interested in what would happen and to find out what exactly Fuinjutsu was. When all of the guild members were outside, including Urza and Mira, they saw Naruto and Natsu facing off about 10 meters away from each other. Natsu had his hands and feet aflame as he grinned at the prospect of fighting that might be strong. Turning over to Naruto, however, changed the mood immediately. Instead of looking prepared for a fight, the blonde had one of his hands in his pocket and the other hand in the air, twirling a paintbrush. Makarov coughed to gather the attention of the guild members and to silence them before he set the rules. The first person to get a knockout or land a clean hit will be the winner. Ready. Natsu responded with an excited, "Osu." While Naruto just hummed in response. Begin. Natsu immediately charged forwards, propelling himself by lighting his feet on fire. However, right before he was in striking range to punch the blonde, Naruto raised his right hand with his index and middle finger pointed straight to the sky and said one word. Seal. Suddenly, Natsu crashed into an invisible barrier and fell down to the ground. He immediately got back up and tried to attack Naruto again through the barrier but failed. Understanding that he couldn't go forwards, Natsu tried to make distance but crashed into something against his back. It's over, Naruto said. Natsu stopped struggling for a moment to glare at the blonde. Are you telling me to give up? And when did you use your seal? I never saw you move. Naruto shook his head. I'm not telling you to give up. In fact, I think that the fact you don't want to give up is a good trait to have. However, you should understand the situation you are in right now. And if you want to know when I did it, remember what I said to you during the mission. Natsu stared at Naruto, his eyes going blank for a moment as he went through his memories earlier in the day. X Shuya X. Flashback. During the mission. Naruto, why didn't you just fight those dark mages? That would have been so much more fun and exciting. Natsu asked as he shouted out his opinion, a small ball of fire erupting from his mouth. Currently, the group of 4 was in the train station waiting for the train to take them back to the town of the guild. Natsu, I already told you. If I don't need to fight or use any of my abilities, I won't because there is no need to. It's called efficiency. Runes are not very taxing on my reserves and they're almost limitless in what they can do. It helps that those dark mages underestimated me and also didn't know what kind of magic I can do, Naruto said. Natsu dropped his head and pouted slightly. But that's so boring, he said. It saves lives, Naruto immediately replied. Natsu raised his head to look at the serious face of Naruto. What do you mean? Naruto dropped his crossed arms from his chest. Okay, what would you rather have, Natsu? A battlefield where you set the rules, Naruto said, raising his right hand, or a battlefield where it's anyone's game? The blonde finished, raising his other hand. Of course I would choose my own battlefield. That's easy, the Dragon Slayer said without hesitation. Naruto nodded calmly. Although it seemed that Naruto was only talking to Natsu, Gray and Cana were also listening in a few feet away, talking together only a few moments before until they heard Naruto bring up the topic. Correct. You would obviously choose the terrain where you set the traps, you know the terrain, and you know every single advantageous place. So, if someone comes into your battlefield and you don't need to fight, would you? Natsu shook his head. It's the same thing. I had no reason to fight those dark mages because they were in my battlefield and under my rules as soon as they let their guard down against a seemingly useless and weak 12-year-old mage. But isn't that kind of like cheating? Natsu asked innocently. Once upon a time, Naruto might have asked the two, but he wasn't the same anymore. No, he would take any advantage he could get. After all, he may be a mage now, but he is truly a ninja at heart. Then you cheated to save lives, Naruto said. X Shuya X. End flashback. Natsu's blank look turned to one of realization. You set it up before the battle began when we walked to our position and my back was turned to you. Natsu yelled accusingly. Naruto nodded his head, his facial expression showing neither shame nor guilt in his actions. Natsu growled before breathing in heavily. The blonde felt an enormous amount of energy build up in the Dragon Slayer and jumped back before pulling out a paper and writing a full seal onto it within 2 seconds. Fire Dragon's Roar. Natsu screamed as the huge magical energy erupted from his mouth and shot forwards as a wide beam at Naruto, immediately breaking through the barrier Naruto had erected. Instead of dodging, however, the blonde stayed still, watching the attack come closer and closer to him. What is he doing? He has to get out of the way. Some of the guild members said in worry of the blonde. Urza and Mira, although they didn't like Naruto, were slightly worried for him. If he took the blunt of the damage from Natsu's all-out attack, that was an immediate visit to the hospital with a stay of possibly a few months. He's fine, Levi said, completely contradicting how many of the other guild members felt. They all turned to her for an explanation, but instead of replying, she pointed at the location of where Naruto stood when he faced the oncoming attack. All the guild members turned to where her finger was pointing and dropped their jaws in shock. Naruto had his hand raised and the paper he was holding in the powerful attack. If his attack was a little stronger, then that seal wouldn't have worked and would have imploded. Naruto raised his head to face Natsu only to find a flaming fist about to hit his face. Having no time to release a seal or perform any substitution techniques, Naruto raised his fist to meet Natsu's. When the two fists collided, both of the boys were immediately thrown back by the force. They both flipped backwards and skidded across the dirt before stopping. Is he getting stronger? Then he's just like me, getting stronger when fighting against someone that is higher than him. Naruto thought with a smirk as he faced Natsu who was panting and heaving from using so much energy. There, I got you to move, Natsu said triumphantly. Naruto nodded his head and smiled as he closed his eyes. Natsu lost, Makarov suddenly said out of nowhere. This time, even Levi was confused. Laxus, who was watching from the second floor of the guild building, had been the only other person to see what the blonde had done, but that was because he had a different perspective. A moment later, a clone erupted from under the ground right where Natsu was standing. It punched Natsu in the chin, sending the Dragon Slayer flying into the air before it kicked him on the stomach, sending Natsu crashing into the ground. Usually, Natsu would be able to get back up, but something was pressing down on him. Pressing down, he used a seal. But when, right? It was when my clone hit you. Seals aren't limited to paper, they can be infused onto the skin, Naruto said as he walked up to Natsu. Good fight, Natsu. Grr, fine. You won this time, but next time, I'll win. Natsu shouted at Naruto. The blonde leaned down and removed the seal on Natsu's stomach and grabbed Natsu's hand to pull him up. When they were face to face again, Naruto smirked at Natsu. You're going to have to get a lot better than that to phase me, Natsu, he said. Natsu grinned in response, prepared to do anything to beat Naruto someday. The winner is Naruto. So friends, this was episode 1 of this magical crossover adventure. If you enjoyed it and want episode 2 soon, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Also comment down your thoughts. What incredible storm magic do you think Naruto will unlock next, and which Earthland mage should join him on his journey? I'll see you in the next episode.